We do want to bring you some breaking news as it's just coming in. We want to take you now to Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, where U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio is discussing an apparent breakthrough in talks with Ukraine on efforts to end Russia's invasion. Let's watch.
And hopefully we'll take this offer now to the Russians. And we hope that they'll say yes, to peace. The ball's now in their court. And but again, the president's objective here is, number one, above everything else, he wants the war to end. And I think today Ukraine has taken a concrete step in that regard. We hope the Russians will reciprocate.
Well, just to add to the Secretary's comments, the Ukrainian delegation today made something very clear, that they share President Trump's vision for peace. They share his determination to end the fighting, to end the killing, to end the tragic kind of meat grinder of people and national treasure that's happening on the front in Ukraine. Number one. Number two, they made concrete steps and concrete proposals, not only accepting our proposal for a full ceasefire, which you can see the details of which are in our joint statement that we released together. But we also got into substantive details on how this war is going to permanently end, what type of guarantees they're going to have for their long-term security and prosperity, but also really looking at what it's going to take to finally end this, the horrific fighting. The other piece that I just want to make very clear is President Trump started this diplomatic effort in the Oval Office, talking to both leaders, both President Putin and President Zelensky back to back. And now that shuttle diplomacy continues. We have a named delegation in terms of next steps from the Russian side. We have a named delegation in terms of next steps from the Ukrainian side. I will talk to my Russian counterpart in the coming days. Secretary Rubio will be with G7 foreign ministers in the next couple of days. We have the NATO Secretary General in the White House on Thursday, and we'll take the process forward from there. So, as a result of that, and I think as a result of this positive step forward, the president has decided to lift the pause on aid and on our security assistance to Ukraine going forward. And that's effective immediately.
All right, your colleagues have chosen 3 questioners. Let's start with Alex Marquardt of CNN.
Thank you. Several questions on the ceasefire. We understood that coming into this was a Ukrainian proposal for a partial ceasefire. How did this become an American proposal for an immediate 30-day ceasefire? And to be clear, you're talking about a complete ceasefire across the front line, not just the aerial and maritime ceasefire that the Ukrainians proposed. And then finally, how do you expect to take this to the Russians? Is it Mr. Witkoff, who we understand is heading to Moscow later this week? Will he deliver that to Putin? Will it be President Trump to President Putin? Will it be you and your counterparts? How will that actually happen and when?
Well, on the first point, your question is yes. That's the offer. The offer is to stop the shooting. The goal here is, the only way out to end this war is to negotiate out of it. There's no military solution to this war. The solution to this war and the way to end it and to achieve the president's objective of peace is to negotiate. But before you can negotiate, you have to stop shooting at each other. And that's what the president has wanted to see, and that's the commitment we got today from the Ukrainian side, their willingness to do that. Obviously now that'll be delivered to the Russians. It'll be delivered to them directly through multiple channels, meaning not only will they obviously see it, it'll be communicated to them through our diplomatic channels, through conversations and other methods, but they'll obviously be well aware. And our hope is that the Russians will say yes, that they will also agree. So the shooting will stop, the killing will stop, the dying will stop, and the talks can begin about how to end this war permanently in a way that's acceptable and enduring for both sides.
Look, there's been all kinds of discussions in terms of different types of ceasefires. You know, there was the deal in terms of grain moving years ago. There's been discussion of halting aerial attacks on each other's infrastructure. The president has made it clear, and certainly made it clear to us, that all fighting needs to stop. And the Ukrainians have agreed to that proposal. They're ready for peace. And now we'll take that to the Russians and get their response.
All right, next, Jennifer Jacobs, CBS.
Great. Hi. Are you expecting any goodwill gestures from Russia? Do you have a deadline in mind for when you're hoping for them to reciprocate on that? Those two things.
Well, we're going to take the offer to them. We're going to tell them this is what's on the table. Ukraine is ready to stop shooting and start talking. And now it'll be up to them to say yes or no. I hope they're going to say yes, and if they do, then I think we made great progress. If they say no, then we'll unfortunately know what the impediment is to peace here. But the president's been abundantly clear he wants the shooting to stop. He wants the warfare to stop. He wants the dying and the suffering to stop. And he believes, and rightfully so, that the only way to end this war is to negotiate an end to it. And we think that it's always easier to negotiate an end to the war when people aren't shooting at each other. That's how the president believes. That's what we hope to achieve. The Ukrainians today have expressed their willingness and readiness to do so immediately. We hope the Russians' answer to that will also be yes.
But no deadline set, sir.
Well, the deadline is we hope to do this as soon as possible. Every day that goes by that this war continues, people die, people are bombed, people are hurt on both sides of this conflict. The president wanted this war to end yesterday and the day before. The president's been clear he wants peace, and so we wanted to see it as soon as possible. So our hope is that the Russians will answer yes as quickly as possible so we can get to the second phase of this, which is real negotiations, not never-ending dialogue, talk forever, but real negotiations to end this conflict in a way that's acceptable to both sides, sustainable, and that ensures the stability and security of Ukraine for the long term.
And on the goodwill gesture, is there anything like the return of the stolen children or anything that you're expecting in return?
Look, we've discussed a number of things, prisoner exchanges, folks that were detained and what have you, but the fighting has to stop. I mean, that's what we agreed today. And just think about it. We've gone from if the war is going to end to now how the war is going to end, and this was an important first step, and that was under President Trump's leadership. He has literally moved the entire global conversation to where we had a very senior Ukrainian delegation with us today. We've had engagements with our Russian counterparts, and now it's how the war is going to end, and that's under President Trump's leadership.
Just to answer your question one more time, the goal here is peace. That's the president's goal. The best goodwill gesture the Russians can provide is to say yes to the offer that the Ukrainians have made to stop the shooting, to stop the fighting, and get to the table. If they do that, that's the best goodwill sign we could see. Obviously, as part of that negotiation, as we're talking about how to end this conflict, there will be a lot of issues to unravel. Among them, not the least of which is the humanitarian concerns, the children, the prisoners of war, all the things that sadly come with these conflicts. But the number one goodwill gesture we could see from the Russians is to see the Ukrainian offer and reciprocate it with a yes.
And next, for Reuters, Daphne Saladakis.
Thank you so much. Could you clarify what security assistance will be resumed? Does this include the PDAs? And why wasn't the minerals deal signed today? What are the outstanding issues there? And if I may, is the relationship with Ukrainian President Zelensky back on track? Do you back him?
Well, let me answer the second or the third. You had two, and then I'll let the security advisor talk about the defense and security assistance. On the second question, well, let me answer first on the minerals deal. As part of our communication today, that is something that was negotiated through our Treasury and his counterpart on the Ukrainian side. And so the president, and you see that expressed, both presidents will instruct the appropriate members of our governments to bring to finality the signature of the deal and the signature of this agreement. So that was communicated today, and that's going to happen. That was not the subject of our talks today. I thought I expressed that on our way in. We were here in pursuit of peace. That doesn't mean the minerals deal is not very important. It most certainly is, and we expressed that today in the statements we put out jointly, that the president, our respective presidents, have instructed the appropriate members of their governments to bring this to finality and to conclusion. The second part of your question was?
Does the security assistance include?
No, there was one after that.
And the Zelensky relationship
There we go.
back on track?
Yeah. What's back on track here, hopefully, is peace. That's what matters the most. I know everyone's looking for who likes this is serious stuff. Okay, this is not Mean Girls. This is not some episode of some television show. This is very serious. Today people will die in this war. They died yesterday, and sadly, unless there's a ceasefire tonight, they'll die tomorrow. The president wants that to stop. That's what he's interested in here. That's why we came here. That's why we're grateful for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia hosting us here. And what we leave here with today is a commitment that the Ukrainians are ready to stop fighting. They're ready to stop the shooting so that they can get to the table and bring about peace for their country and for the world on the security.
Well, I mean, I just can't echo enough. President Trump's president of peace. That's what he's demanding, and he's willing to take tough measures on all sides to drive that home. And in terms of the security assistance, it's the current presidential drawdown authority. I'll refer to the Defense Department on the eaches of what munition was where in the process, but it's the current PDA that will proceed to the Ukrainians.
All right, everyone, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for
Effective
your
immediately.
patience.
Yeah, thanks for your patience.
We've been listening to U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio and National Security Advisor Mike Waltz discussing a new deal between the U.S. and Ukraine. Ukraine says it would accept a U.S. proposal calling for an immediate 30-day ceasefire with Russia. The U.S. is also immediately lifting its pause on intelligence sharing with Ukraine. The U.S., remember, paused sharing intel shortly after an Oval Office meeting between President Trump and Zelensky. That meeting blew up more than a week ago. The U.S. will also resume security assistance to Ukraine, and now Secretary of State Marco Rubio is essentially encouraging Russia to get on board, saying the ball's in their court. Let's go ahead and bring in Sam Vinograd, a CBS News national security contributor and former Assistant Secretary for Counterterrorism at the Department of Homeland Security. She joins us from Washington. Sam, obviously this is major movement in this conflict, but at the same time, this is a proposal hammered out between the U.S. and Ukraine, with Russia not having a seat at the table in this particular meeting. What is your reaction?
Well, my reaction is that Ukraine now has some leverage back in these negotiations by now having access to U.S. security assistance and intelligence used for offensive operations into Russia. Ukraine now has more leverage to enter negotiations with Russia on more equal terms. After Zelensky's visit to Washington, after security assistance was frozen, after this offensive intelligence was taken off the table, Ukraine was really operating from a position of weakness. That has changed. Now, of course, the big question is, what is Russia going to say next? Getting Russia to agree to a ceasefire that the Ukrainians would agree to is not a foregone conclusion. And I'll note that Secretary of State Rubio and National Security Advisor Waltz kept stressing that the president's sole focus is stopping the fighting. And the question here is, what are the costs associated with that for both sides? We haven't heard what those costs would be for the Ukrainians nor for the Russians. So this is a significant step, but getting Putin on board in a meaningful way is going to be quite difficult. Can you explain to me a little further about how Ukraine's leverage position has changed? Prior to the United States agreeing to reestablish security assistance and intelligence sharing, Ukraine was facing a significant vacuum in support from the United States. While European countries announced that they would step forward to provide more security assistance to Ukraine, it's not a one-for-one exchange. So absent billions of dollars in U.S. security assistance, Ukraine was going to lose really critical access to both funding as well as actual military assets, Lindsay, that the Europeans just could not replace. And from an intelligence perspective, not having access to U.S. intelligence that allowed Ukraine to strike inside of Russia made Russia feel most likely, the combination of those two things, like it had the upper hand in both the war against Ukraine and in any negotiations to try to resolve the conflict. So we also have reporting from our Charlie D'Agata that there will be an immediate resumption of the Presidential Drawdown Authority, which refers to roughly $3.8 billion in U.S. military aid. This has already been approved. So largely air defense systems, artillery, some support of Ukraine's F-16s. How significant is that? This is huge. And again, losing access to $3.8, almost $4 billion of U.S. security assistance for Ukraine so quickly was truly catastrophic in thinking about the tides of the war and who is going to have the upper hand just from a pure military conflict standpoint. Putting this back on the table shows that Ukraine will be able to hold territory in the way it has so far if Russia does not agree to come to the table in a meaningful way to stop the fighting. When these billions of dollars were taken off the table, Lindsay, Ukraine was viewed most likely as weak and highly vulnerable by Russia, which was not optimal from so many vantage points. So both regaining access to this $3.8 billion in security assistance, regaining access to U.S. intelligence, and having the U.S. by its side as it enters negotiations is going to be quite significant. both in terms of the situation on the ground in Ukraine, trying to hold territory, as well as walking into negotiations with the Russians on an actual ceasefire proposal.
So, Sam, we know that the statement from the U.S. and Ukraine includes a snippet saying that each side, both delegations, agreed to name their negotiating teams and immediately begin negotiations toward an enduring peace. So this is an initial proposal and a step, but it appears to me that there is still quite a long way to go before we actually have a lasting 30-day ceasefire.
There is a huge amount of runway between where we are today and a lasting 30-day ceasefire. However, absent this step in getting the Ukrainians on board and getting security assistance restarted and intelligence sharing restarted, we'd have an even longer runway. So I don't want to minimize the importance of this moment. I do want to stress that when we think about getting the Russians on board and getting them not just to name negotiators, that part is easy. I've dealt with the Russians on negotiations on various things, but getting them to show up in a way where they're really ready to talk substantively is going to take a lot of behind the scenes work. It's going to involve, most likely, if the administration is willing, a mixture of pressure, threats of additional sanctions and other punitive measures if Russia doesn't come forward, as well as a strong vision of what the peace could look like. So both positive and negative levers being pulled here, but that's going to take a lot of back channeling with the Russians that'll likely play out behind the cameras to get them to show up in a meaningful way. And remember, Russia broke 2 ceasefires already in Ukraine since the conflict started. So it's not just getting them to show up to the table, but getting them to show up in a way where they're actually committed to a lasting ceasefire.
Sam, Secretary Rubio was asked why the minerals deal wasn't signed today. Give us a little bit of background on that. Also, the secretary said that was not the subject of today's talks. It says it's still important, but today's mission was in pursuit of peace. Does that surprise you?
It surprises me a bit, but more from the Ukrainian perspective. This critical minerals deal would involve the United States having a stake in the development, really, of critical minerals in Ukraine and having most likely some kind of actual presence as part of the development of those minerals, which the administration has touted as its own kind of security guarantee. Because if the United States has a vested interest in Ukraine's critical minerals development, then the Russians would read that the United States was committed to Ukraine's stability and security. The Ukrainians have asked for more explicit security guarantees from the United States, but this critical minerals deal was viewed as a first step, as a very nice thing to have. And so I would have expected that getting this deal signed quickly would have been something that the Ukrainians would have wanted and something that the administration would have wanted, because Trump has also viewed this critical minerals deal as a way to get paid back for the almost $200 billion or so in security assistance that the United States has already provided to Ukraine. So I'm surprised that the Ukrainians didn't view signing this deal as a measure of a security guarantee. And I'm surprised that the Trump administration didn't want to get this agreement penned as soon as possible so that Trump could say that he will be paid, that the U.S. will be paid back for the security assistance we've already provided. But Rubio and Waltz did indicate that Bessent, the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, could sign this deal relatively quickly.
And Sam, then there's the whole Europe of it all. We know that Europe was left scrambling after some of the administration's moves in pausing Ukraine, pausing intelligence, with Ukraine stepping up their own contributions and not only their own defense spending, but aid to Ukraine as well. We know that they've had emergency meetings and summits, which President Zelensky has been a part of. So where did today's developments leave our European allies?
I think today's developments have left our European allies in exactly the same place, Lindsay. This is not their first time dealing with the Trump administration, nor dealing with Vladimir Putin. And what I mean by that is President Trump could change his mind on these matters quite quickly. And what's important is ensuring that the Ukrainians have the support that they need so that Vladimir Putin can't march further into not just Ukraine, but into Ukraine and then elsewhere into Europe. So I would imagine that the Europeans will remain committed to the increases in defense spending that they've announced overall, as well as increased support to Ukraine, because they no longer view U.S. assistance to Ukraine as a non-negotiable for any U.S. administration. At the same time, they also know that Vladimir Putin is not exactly a trustworthy interlocutor. So this deal could fall apart for reasons wholly unrelated to Ukraine and completely related to Vladimir Putin. But Trump could choose to blame the Ukrainians for that, could withdraw support. So for all of those reasons, the Europeans will more than likely remain committed to enhanced defense spending and enhanced security assistance to Ukraine while these negotiations are ongoing.
And maybe even committing to putting peacekeeping troops in Ukraine, right?
They might. You know, you raise a great point, Lindsay, because the Europeans have previously said, both the French, President Macron, and Prime Minister Starmer have discussed as well, the presence of about 30,000 European boots on the ground peacekeeping forces as a security guarantee for Ukraine. It has been a sticking point for the Ukrainians that the United States was not willing to commit forces to that peacekeeping mission, which is why President Zelensky has been very focused on getting some other kind of security guarantee from the United States, so that if Putin violates any ceasefire agreement, he knows he's not just messing with the Europeans, but also directly messing with U.S. troops and U.S. national security interests. So the Europeans likely remain committed to putting boots on the ground. The United States still is not willing to do so. But that largely also means that at some juncture, the Europeans are going to have to be brought into these negotiations to ensure that what they've promised before is still on the table and that they're ready to implement it.
Sam Vinograd, we certainly appreciate all of your expertise in breaking this down for us, these tremendous developments here. Thank you for your time.